Welcome back to the deep dive. Today we are getting into well, something truly cosmic. The human drive to find order in the universe.
And the sheer beauty of it when we do.
Exactly. I was thinking about this great quote from Johannes Kepler that just, it sets the stage perfectly.
Oh, which one?
He talks about the treasures hidden in the heavens and how they're so rich, precisely in order that the human mind shall never be lacking in fresh nourishment.
That's a perfect encapsulation of our mission today. We're going to track that whole shift from just, ancient humans looking up at the sky,
Right.
all the way to ironclad scientific law. And we'll do it through the really turbulent lives of Kepler and later Isaac Newton.
It's this amazing quest for cosmic order. And the sources suggest we live in a kind of what they call an in-between universe.
Right. It's not totally static, but it's not just random chaos either.
And that's the key, isn't it?
It's everything. If nothing ever changed, there'd be no science. If things changed completely at random, there'd be no science. We're in this sweet spot where things change, but according to predictable patterns, rules, what we call the laws of nature.
So that's our journey for today. We'll explore how early humans first decoded the sky, then how mysticism,
Oh,
well, it threw a wrench in the works.
a big one.
And finally, the huge discovery that completely redefined Earth's place in the cosmos. So let's unpack this.
We should start way back with the earliest humans. Long before any written history, they were, profoundly good observers.
You had to be right for survival.
Absolutely. Tracking game, finding safe routes, and you can just picture them gathered around a campfire on a dark night, looking up. The sources are clear they were intensely watching the stars.
And then they start doing what humans do, imposing order, seeing patterns.
Exactly. They project familiar shapes onto those points of light, constellation.
Like the Great Bear.
The Great Bear is a perfect example. And of course, these pictures aren't really there. They're just a reflection of our need to connect the dots, to categorize.
And it reflects what's important to the people doing the naming.
Oh, for sure. You have 17th century European sailors who are seeing the southern skies for the first time. What do they name the constellations after?
Their tools, I bet.
The toucan, the telescope, the compass. And if we were doing it today, the sources joke we might see, bicycles or mushroom clouds. Our own hopes and fears.
But the sky wasn't just a curiosity. It was a tool. That predictability was vital.
100%. That regularity was everything. Stars rise in the east, they set in the west. Different constellations appear in different seasons. This was their calendar.
It's the ultimate calendar.
It told them when to plant, when to harvest, when tribes should meet up. It was literally a matter of life and death.
And they built these incredible monuments all over the world to track it, like the Kiva in Chaco Canyon, built by the Anasazi.
In the 11th century, on June 21st, the longest day of the year, a single shaft of sunlight comes through a window and perfectly hits a special niche.
And that's not a one-off. You see it at Angkor Wat, Stonehenge, Abu Simbel in Egypt.
Chichen Itza in Mexico. The precision is just stunning. There's another one in the American Southwest, this sun dagger.
Oh, right, with the spiral carved in the rock.
Yeah. On the summer solstice, a dagger of light cuts right through the middle of the spiral. And on the winter solstice, two daggers frame it perfectly. The dedication that takes is just phenomenal.
And that regularity, that predictability, it must have been so comforting. It was like a metaphor for immortality. The sun always comes back.
The moon always returns. But then, after all this careful observation, a curious idea arose. The sources call it an assault of mysticism.
Astrology.
Astrology, the idea that the planets, the wandering stars, didn't just mark time, but that they directly influenced your life.
And wow, has that idea stuck around? It's so much easier to find an astrology magazine than an astronomy one.
The numbers are wild. Astrologers outnumber astronomers 10 to 1 in the U.S. You're far more likely to get asked, what's your sign?
Yeah.
Than,
What are your thoughts on stellar nucleosynthesis? Yeah.
Exactly. And the core claim is that the position of the planets at the moment you're born shapes your destiny. It started with kings and empires, but then in Alexandrian Egypt, it trickled down to personal horoscopes.
And we still use the language without even thinking about it. Disaster.
Geek for bat star.
Influenza.
Italian, astral influence.
Even Mazel Tov.
Yeah, that one goes all the way back to Babylonian for good constellation. It's baked into our language.
And people took it incredibly seriously. The source points to these London mortality stats from 1632.
I know, this is incredible. 13 people were listed as having died from planet.
From planet. That's more than died of cancer that year.
It is. It shows you how deeply embedded that belief was. And it was all codified by Claudius Ptolemy back in the 2nd century.
In his book, The Tetrabiblos.
Right. He linked the planets to everything from your looks and personality to, well, even birth defects.
But when you actually put modern astrology under the microscope, it falls apart.
Completely. For one, it ignores basic science, like the precession of the equinoxes. The Earth wobbles on its axis, so the constellations have all shifted over the last 2,000 years. Your sign isn't really your sign.
And it ignores everything we've discovered since then. Quasars, pulsars, entire galaxies.
None of that is in the charts. And the predictions themselves are so vague and inconsistent. Just compare the horoscope for Libra in the New York Post and the Daily News on the same day.
They'll say completely different things.
Wildly different things. But the simplest, most powerful refutation is the twin test.
Right. Twins born minutes apart in the same place. They should have identical fates according to astrology.
And we know, just from life, that's not true at all. Their lives can go in massively different directions.
So that's the real dividing line. Astronomy is a science studying what's really there. Astrology is a pseudoscience, a claim without evidence.
Exactly. But here's the twist. Ptolemy wasn't just an astrologer. He was also a brilliant astronomer.
He was trying to solve the biggest puzzle of his day, that weird backward motion of the planets.
It's retrograde motion. It was a huge problem. The Egyptians even called Mars who travels backwards. Ptolemy's solution was the ultimate expression of the Earth-centered or geocentric model.
Because if the Earth is in the middle and everything moves in perfect circles, planets shouldn't go backwards.
Right. So he had to invent this incredibly complex but clever geometric machine to explain it.
The epicycles and deferents.
Yeah. Imagine a big circle, the deferent. Now, on the edge of that circle, you attach a smaller wheel, the epicycle. The planet rides on the small wheel, while the small wheel rides on the big one.
And that combination makes it look like the planet does a little loop-the-loop.
It creates that backward motion. It was complicated, but for the accuracy they had back then, it worked.
But it locked in the Earth-centered view. And because the church backed it, it basically stopped progress in astronomy for 1,000 years.
For a millennium. Until 1543. And a man named Nicholas Copernicus,
Who comes along with this incredibly daring idea, the heliocentric hypothesis.
sun at the center, and Earth is just planet number 3 going around in a circle.
And people hated it.
They did. Martin Luther called him a fool, said Joshua commanded the sun to stand still in the Bible, not the Earth. And the Catholic Church put his book on the forbidden list until 1835.
So that's the world one. Our next guy, Johannes Kepler, is born into in 1571, a really dangerous time to challenge doctrine.
He's a fascinating figure. He stands right on that dividing line. He was an astrologer, but he was also, you could argue, the very first astrophysicist.
And his early work was really driven by this deep mystical religious impulse.
Oh, completely. He wrote Geometry is God himself. He had this beautiful theory trying to link the 6 known planets to the 5 perfect geometric shapes, the Platonic solids.
It's a cosmic mystery.
The cosmic mystery. He thought the spacing of the planets had to reflect this divine geometry, but to prove it, he needed data. The best data.
And there was only one person on Earth who had it, Tycho Brahe.
The flamboyant Danish nobleman with the gold nose, the greatest observer of the pre-telescope era.
So Kepler goes to Prague, hoping to get his hands on Tycho's observations to prove his own mystical theory.
And it was a very difficult collaboration. They did not trust each other at all. Tycho was secretive, Kepler was impatient, but then on his deathbed, Tycho gave Kepler all his data.
With that famous line, "Let me not seem to have lived in vain."
A really poignant moment, and it changed history. Because when Kepler tested his beautiful Platonic solids theory against Tycho's hard data,
It was completely wrong.
totally wrong. And this is the moment, this is where science wins. Kepler had to choose between his beloved, beautiful theory and the cold, hard facts. He chose the facts.
He focused in on Mars, which had the weirdest orbit.
The most difficult one to figure out, he tried for years to fit it to a perfect circle, but 2 of Tycho's data points were off by just 8 minutes of arc.
Which is nothing. It's such a tiny angle. Most people would have just ignored it.
Right. Blamed an error in the measurement. But Kepler knew how good Tycho was. And he wrote, this is so powerful. He said those 8 minutes pointed the road to a complete reformation in astronomy.
He had the courage to reject the perfect circle, the symbol of divine perfection, and try something else. An ellipse.
A squashed circle. An idea that had been around since the ancient Greeks, but no one had applied it to the heavens. And from that insight came his 3 revolutionary laws.
Okay, let's break them down. Kepler's first law.
Simple. A planet moves in an ellipse with the sun at one of the 2 focuses. So the sun isn't in the center, it's offset.
Kepler's second law.
Planets sweep out equal areas in equal times, which really just means the planet moves faster when it's closer to the sun and slower when it's farther away.
And the third, the Harmonic Law, the one that ties all the planets together.
P squared equals a cubed. The square of the time it takes to orbit its period, P, is proportional to the cube of its average distance from the sun, A.
And you can test that so easily. Jupiter is about 5 times farther from the sun than Earth is.
So away is 5. 5 cubed, 5 times 5 times 5 is 125.
And the square root of 125 is about 11.
And Jupiter's orbit takes 11 years. It's a perfect mathematical harmony.
But what's so amazing about Kepler is he didn't just stop at how they moved. He wanted to know why.
He was searching for a cause. He suggested there was a force, something akin to magnetism coming from the sun. It was the first physical, non-mystical explanation for why the planets move.
Which is when he declared astronomy is part of physics. He bridged the gap.
He did, the last scientific astrologer and the first astrophysicist. But his own life was just filled with turmoil, excommunication, war, his mother being accused of witchcraft.
Right, he had to go defend her in court.
Yeah.
And he even wrote this early work of science fiction, the Somnium or the Dream.
He did, and it's fascinating. He used it to describe what it would be like to stand on the moon and see the Earth move.
Oh.
He correctly described the moon's brutal climate.
But he also made a mistake, a really interesting one.
He suggested the regular circular shapes of the lunar craters might be the work of intelligent life, which kind of foreshadowed the whole canals on Mars controversy centuries later.
So Kepler lays all this groundwork. And then 36 years after he dies, Isaac Newton is born.
Born on Christmas Day, 1642, the man who puts all the pieces together. During a plague outbreak, at age 23, he invents calculus and figures out gravity.
He starts with the law of inertia. An object in motion stays in motion in a straight line.
So he thinks about the moon. It's moving. It should be flying off in a straight line tangentially out into space.
But it doesn't.
It doesn't. So some force must be constantly pulling it back toward the Earth. That force, he realized, was gravity.
And the really earth-shattering idea was that this is a universal force. The same gravity that pulls an apple from a tree is the one holding the moon in its orbit.
The laws of heaven and the laws of Earth are the same. And he worked out the math. The inverse square law.
Gravity gets weaker with distance.
Precisely. The force declines as the square of the distance. So if you're twice as far away, the force is only 1/4 as strong. And that explains exactly why planets move slower when they're farther from the sun. The sun's pull is weaker out there.
So Newton's laws, from pure theory, ended up deriving all 3 of Kepler's laws.
Perfectly. Kepler described how it worked empirically. Newton explained why it worked fundamentally. He showed, as he put it, the frame of the system of the world.
So if you zoom out, this whole story is this massive transition.
It's huge. Kepler and Newton proved that these simple, elegant mathematical laws run through all of nature, on Earth and in the sky, and it proved that our minds, human thought, can actually resonate with the deep workings of the cosmos.
And yet, after all of that, Newton was still so incredibly humble.
Oh, that quote is one of the best in all of science. He said he felt like a boy playing on the seashore, finding a prettier shell here and there.
While the great ocean of truth lay all undiscovered before me.
Just beautiful.
So, a final thought to leave you with on all this. The entire scientific revolution we just described, it really hinged on one thing.
Kepler's 8 minutes of arc.
Exactly. His courage to abandon the idea of perfection. The perfect circle all to accommodate that tiny, imperfect piece of data.
So if the whole path forward required them to abandon their dearest illusions to face reality, it makes you wonder, what small, seemingly insignificant empirical details are we ignoring today? What's our modern-day 8 minutes of arc that might be pointing the way to the next great reformation in science?
Okay, let's unpack this one last time. We started with early humans using the sky as their calendar. We saw the rise of astrology. Remember, disaster just means bad star, and Ptolemy's complicated Earth-centered model. Then Copernicus challenged everything, and Kepler, driven by those 8 minutes of arc, found the truth in the ellipse. And finally, Newton tied it all together with universal gravity. He proved the laws of physics up there are the same as down here. That is your shortcut to being well-informed on the harmony of the worlds. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive.